I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen. I'm the editor and VP of Streaming Media. Welcome to session 2 of day 2 of our 6th Streaming Media Connect event, Streaming Media West Connect. We'd obviously hoped to be in Huntington Beach this week, but it was not to be. So thank you all for joining us again virtually. I do hope, I'm not going to say we will because that's come back to bite me before, but our plans are to be in person again for Streaming Media East in Boston in May 24th and 25th to be precise. And we'll be opening up the call for speakers for Streaming Media East 2022, as well as for another Connect event, another virtual event in February. We'll be opening up the speakers or the call for speakers for that again as well. Before we jump into our next panel discussion, which will be about how to move your workflow to the cloud, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom window rather than in the chat. That makes it easier for your moderator and I to keep track of those questions. If you have any other questions, they can go in the chat, but questions for the panelists, please put in the Q&A tab. Also, live transcripts, live subtitles are turned on. If you want to turn them off, go to the live transcript, the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Click on that and then select disable transcripts, and that will turn them off. Finally, if you're here, you're registered in a drawing to win a $50 Amazon gift card. We'll be announcing the winner of that at the end of the session. I would like to thank our diamond sponsors for Streaming Media West Connect. Signient, Limelight Networks, Conviva, and Video Guys for helping to make this whole week possible. And I'll pass things back to our producer, Bill, for a pre-roll video from our diamond sponsors.
NDI November, NDI products and NDI guests, including Dr. Cross to kick everything off November 2nd. Start watching Tuesdays at 3 p.m.
Register now at videoguys.com to make sure you don't miss any of our NDI November webinars. Registering will give you a chance to win one of our giveaways, including a HuddleCam HD Pro EPTZ webcam with NDI, a Telestream Wirecast Pro license for Windows or Mac, a BirdDog Flex of your choice, the New Tech University NDI class and exam, or a copy of the unofficial guide to NDI.
In this era of streaming video, we are pioneers, helping make your stories more vibrant. Conviva lives in billions of apps on devices all over the world, measuring trillions of data points each day to provide real-time insights for your content, ads, and social. Conviva. Every stream, every screen, every second.
And I would also like to thank our panel sponsor, that is TAG Video Systems, for making this panel possible. And Peter Wharton from TAG will be joining our moderator in just a few minutes. Speaking of our moderator, Magnus Svensson, you're becoming a regular fixture at these online streaming media events. And I'm not criticizing our own events, but boy, we're all getting a little tired of being on Zoom, aren't we?
Absolutely. And I can guarantee you Stockholm is not a Huntington Beach this time of the year. So
okay, well, then maybe, you know, if the alternative is being outside at Stockholm, then you're better off inside on Zoom.
That's true. So that's true. That's a good part of it. Thank you, Eric.
All right. Well, thanks again, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. This will be definitely an interesting panel. We had some prep calls with speakers and panelists, and I can guarantee you, it's a well spent hour. My name is Magnus Svensson. I work at a company called Eyevinn Technology. I work as a media solution specialist, and we are helping customers across the world with streaming media competence and expertise, both strategical, technical, as well as development. So, and we're also very independent. So that's why I can lead this panel and guide you through the cloud migrations. But without experts, it won't be a discussion. So let's jump into the panelists. And first of all, also the panel sponsor, Peter Wharton.
Thanks, Magnus. Great to be here. Really nice to be here.
Tell me a bit about yourself and your company and your background.
Sure. So I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at TAG today. And today we're running over 30,000 monitoring nodes in the cloud for our customers and growing exponentially, it seems. I've actually been involved in the cloud and streaming media since 2000 when I helped launch the live video CDN. And I've worked with multiple development teams in their cloud migration since 2014. And in 2018, actually helped move a major broadcast network in the US into the cloud. So I've been all in on the cloud since the last 7 or 8 years, I'd say.
Sounds like you've been around. So.
Yeah.
And our next panelist is Gerry Field. Reveal yourself and present yourself.
Good morning, Magnus, Peter, how are you?
Good to see you.
Gerry Field, I'm the Vice President of Technology and Distribution Services for American Public Television, and we are the largest syndicator of programming for US public television stations. We work along with PBS, but we are not part of PBS. And we've been around since 1961. Actually, for those of you who may go back that far in the US, as we were originally founded as the Eastern Educational Television Network. So we've been distributing content to public television stations before they were even public television stations. We have a large catalog of programming that we release every year, as well as back catalog that are staple programs for public television stations. And we also program and distribute 22 different 24-hour multicast channels, Create, which is a lifestyle channel, and World, which is a news and public affairs program channel that we, our partners are WGBH in Boston, or GBH now in Boston, and WNET in New York. So we've made a pretty significant shift in the last number of years to virtually all of our processes being based in the cloud.
Interesting. We'll hear more about that later on. And final panelist is a fellow European and Scandinavian, Loke. Please present yourself and your background and where you come from.
Sure. My name is Loke Dupont. I'm a solution architect with TV2 in Denmark. We are a commercial broadcaster operating out only in Denmark, but have a large number of channels that we broadcast both over traditional distribution, but also direct to consumer over the internet or OTT. I've been working with streaming media for about 10, 15 years now in different roles, both as a vendor and now as a customer in the streaming media industry, at least. So yeah, thanks.
Cool, good. Let's get started with the discussion. And I think we should start with a quick overview what actually cloud migration means and what we're meaning with it. And maybe you, Peter, can take us a bit of the overview from what is a cloud migration.
So cloud migration is basically moving your workflows into the cloud. And you do it both from the media company consumer side, where you actually move your workflows, but also from a technology side, having to find vendors and technologies that work as well in the cloud as they work with you on premises. And I think there are really 4 ways you can move to the cloud. You can rehost, which is basically taking that same technology stack you had and moving it to the cloud and just adapting it to make it work, getting rid of things like multicast and stuff like that. Or you re-platform, where you take it and you tinker with it and make some improvements and optimizations. And now we're sort of seeing more and more where there are cloud native solutions, where you take a solution, you refactor it, where it's actually either done cloud native from the ground up, or you take what you started with and you totally rewrite it to be optimized for the cloud. And I think finally where we're going to end up with down the road, and I hope to get there sooner rather than later, is where we actually reinvent. And that's where, instead of actually taking the same workflows and just creating technology that adapts them to the cloud or is cloud native, we actually totally rethink the processes we do for media and reinvent how we create media. Because if you look at what we do, so much of the workflows and the way we work are constrained by the limitations of the technologies we deployed all the way back from the 60s and 70s even. I mean, today's production switcher just looks like a big version of a 1960s production switcher in some ways. And so, and playout isn't all that different. It moved from tape to disk-based to integrated to cloud, but it's still a lot of the same thing. And I think there's a room to really rethink how we get content to consumers from the camera and change that model.
Yeah. Gerry, your experience and what do you define as cloud migration? You have done it in a quite big scale.
In terms of our business, as a distributor, much of the way that we operate has changed. We used to rely a lot on UPS trucks and delivering boxes of videotapes to various places, but we're clearly not doing that anymore. All of our submission is coming through cloud-based interfaces, both for the business end of it as well as the payload of content that's coming into us. The first place that any content hits us is in our cloud repository, and then we take it from there. So we may sync with that for any other kind of needs that we have on-prem. And then also it just makes the workflow a whole lot easier as well than what we were doing when we started the process of accepting file-based media. With cloud-based, we don't have to really give as many constraints on the suppliers as we used to before. We used to try to have to queue people and kind of manage that a lot tighter. But with the cloud-based, of course, anybody can basically access that cloud and upload their content when they want. The part of it, though, that I want to bring back to is that our basic core business is broadcast television. So the delivery to the consumer for us still is through our client local broadcast public television stations. And that world has changed quite a bit as well, not only in the way that they operate, but also the fact that that cloud-based services have become much more important to the local stations as well. So we're seeing a need to be able to feed our content both for broadcast one-to-many, which is still very viable and really very important, but also to a lot of online services that the stations are operating. Viewers have an expectation that something that they are seeing on a broadcast schedule is going to be available for them to stream. So we're trying to enable that as well.
Okay, anything to add from your perspective as a Nordic broadcaster?
So I work mainly on the distribution piece of the cloud migration. So the stuff I'm looking after is the distribution of the content that we already produced in some way to the end users. And that's sort of, for an OTT service, that sort of started in a cloud environment more or less, because naturally a CDN you could think of as a cloud thing. You go to a CDN and that they run a service for you and you don't have to have any infrastructure yourselves. But what we've been doing is migrating more of the infrastructure that's further up the chain. So we've been migrating our live ingest nodes, the packagers that produce the different streaming formats, all of that stuff we used to have on premise in the data center, and we moved that to the cloud now and are continuing to move further up the chain. But also it provides some interesting different options for us, like being able to stand up channels that we tear down afterwards for short running events. So there's interesting parts in it that you also get different options when you do that migration.
What are the challenges and differences between live and file-based VOD migration and cloud infrastructure? Loke.
Yes, so for live, it's tricky because you got to get a live signal from somewhere, and typically, at least in our case, that's SDI inputs. So there's some physical SDI signaling somewhere on premise that we have to move to the cloud. The other challenge of live is, of course, as you're adding more steps to move that somewhere else, you'll add latency, and latency is something that we typically want to avoid. So there's definitely a balancing act there in how much latency you add by adding a long chain to move that signal, and how you can move it to the cloud without compromising stability. Because, of course, as we all know, internet connections are not always perfect, and at some point it goes over the internet in that scenario, and that could be a challenge. Whereas if you're doing file-based workflows, file-based tend to be more resilient. You tend to get the files more ahead of time, so you have more time to catch up in some ways. But you can also retry that transmission if that fails. You can't really retry a live signal. If the live signal goes down, it goes down. There's nothing else to sort of retry that because you're sending it out as soon as you get it in. So there's different challenges that are much different between live and VOD that makes live, at least in my view, a lot more challenging to move to the cloud environment.
Peter, do you want to add something there on that topic?
I think Loki hit the nail on the head beautifully. Live production of all the different workflows of production, playout, and distribution is the last obstacle to really being able to build end-to-end workflows in the cloud, which is where you really get the value both in streamlined operations and cost efficiency. We've seen live production move to the cloud for cloud native organizations like esports, who are building really complicated live production workflows in the cloud. And their requirements are somewhat different than a major broadcaster. But we're also seeing where some major broadcasters, like in Sky would be a perfect example in Europe, are moving live production into the cloud and doing it at scale. And so we're seeing this happen. And you're right, you have to address latency, reliability, you have to create control, and really also, but the beauty of cloud is being able to build exactly the workflow you need for the complexity of the event in live production, which you never built with an on-premises system. So you might have something with 1 ME or 6 MEs. It wouldn't matter. You could build whatever you needed. And you're seeing these layered production systems where they have multiple production systems stacked to build this very layered, complex event. So we're seeing this, and it scales on demand. So, and you're only paying for why you use it. So there are a lot of advantages in getting live production to the cloud, and that's where a lot of effort is being focused on today.
I'd bring in, I'd jump in if I could with a couple of the business parts of it as well, and where our model is clearly different than a commercial sponsored model, where live and near live programming for us is still going to remain on our typical and historic at this point delivery by satellite to local stations and then through broadcast to consumers. And partially that has to do with the idea of turnaround time on the programs. It may have to do also with limited rights windows for a news and public affairs program, where it's actually much more efficient for us to be able to put that through a live traditional broadcast chain than it would be to deal with the cloud, because the management of that and the cost involved in it. But I should say, though, that the significant milestone this past summer is that the new interconnection system that the public media system has set up in the US has now gotten to the point where we've eliminated most of our non-live or near live satellite feeds. The very traditional way for us to deliver content to stations has now been all moved to cloud-based delivery to stations on demand. And as a supplier, as a distributor, it's a significant advantage for us, because we're now no longer held kind of hostage in some ways to a limited availability on linear satellite feeds to stations. Stations can wind up taking anything in our catalog that's in the cloud and use it whenever they want within the rights windows. So it's another aspect of cloud migration, I think, that maybe might not be immediately obvious, but it's one that's been a significant one for us.
And Magnus, can I add one other thing to that? That's great, Gerry. I mean, because you're right exactly that, there is no longer the need to have a linear channel that's mostly file-based content being played out, delivered as a linear channel to the endpoints the way it used to be. But the flip side is, in live production, there's a lot more moving pieces to a live production, especially like in a major news organization, than just a TD running a switcher, right? So what we're also seeing is, like with some of these news organizations, where we're standing up hundreds of multi-viewers in the cloud that an operator can access remotely and configure from working from home, so that now they can have 200 or 400 producers all working from home, switching between live events and producing live events without actually going into an office and managing this from anywhere in the world. So it's a wholly different model too of how they're building live production at scale with some of these companies. And I find that really intriguing, because it definitely changes both the efficiency, but also breaks down a lot of the silos that were occurring between production and delivery that were there before.
And speed and responsiveness are a major part of it as well.
We have a question on the topic around scheduling on live streams from Kate. And is that something you can talk about? They have a 15 to 20 unique live streams, and how do you schedule and how do you plan these type of live channels and live events?
So I guess the question is, are these live streams that you're scheduling that you want to launch OTT channels to deliver, or are these live streams that you're scheduling to come into a production environment? I mean, I guess I don't quite understand exactly what the focus of the question is there, but certainly there are lots of platforms out there now for OTT delivery, for example, that let you do ad hoc live events and launch live channels. And so the real key is being able to build these workflows in the cloud that you need, and then being able to snapshot them and launch them only when you need them, so you're not paying for it. I mean, you know, the old model was you took the truck to the venue for a sporting event, you stood it up, and you did it on Friday for a Sunday event, and sat there and ran for 48 hours before the event. After you got everything working, you don't touch anything. But in the cloud, it's like, okay, do a rehearsal, get it working, now turn it off and come back to 2 days from now, hit the button half an hour before the event and have it running. Because you don't want to pay for it just sitting there where you're not using it. So that orchestration is key.
Loke, you mentioned that you will be able to spin up live channels in the short notice and take them down again. So maybe you can reveal something here.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the question either, and the scheduling. I'm not that familiar with the playout systems necessarily, but and when we do these sort of event-based lives, we spin up the distribution infrastructure. The actual playout systems are still so far kept on premise as physical hardware that we then, I guess we can turn it on and off, but that becomes less important when it's on premise, because one of the challenges I think with the live playout systems is if you're not doing esports and you're trying to move a traditional TV broadcast, is if you're used to a live switching environment where you can go frame accurate and you can have exact timings with SDI or even 70-20-110, once you move to the cloud, you can't really do that in the same way in a lot of cases. I think AWS created something they called CDI for doing that sort of thing in the cloud environment. But I think when you're doing productions for esports, for instance, you sort of get used to a different way of looking at those things. But if you're used to traditional playout systems, that change could be quite hard to do, because you're used to working in one way and you have to work in a completely different way if you want to do it in a cloud environment.
Yeah. Earlier, when we prepared, we talked about the way of working and corporate governance and it changes when you're moving into the cloud, Luke. And can you tell us a bit more about that? How that actually simplified your daily work a bit when it comes to also the way of working and corporate governance?
Sure. So we were lucky enough that when we did most of our migration to a cloud environment, we got relatively free hands to move stuff into the cloud environment, and basically got an empty AWS account more or less, and we could set up things and spin things up. That's something we couldn't really do when we were on premise, because there was a lot of approval processing, getting assigned places for it in the data center, getting networking hookups and looking at all the sort of interconnects that we needed and getting those done. Whereas in a cloud environment, we can sort of spin it up. And I think one of the things that are important when you're moving to the cloud is to give the team the tools they need to do that and not restrict them too much. If we had to work within a system where we had to get approval for spinning up an instance in the cloud every time we had to do that, or if every time we made a minor networking change, it would have been completely impossible for us to do that move. And I think a lot of companies tend to add process to their internal IT infrastructure, because once they've been burned by something going down or something not working, they'll add another process to get approval for that. And when you're moving to the cloud, you sort of might use that as an excuse to also remove some of those impediments from the team, so they can be more free to actually do the right thing. It also does mean that a single developer could theoretically cost a lot of money if they spun up infrastructure that they didn't consider the cost for. And that's the tricky part. You need to find a way to balance those and keep monitoring the costs so it doesn't run away from you, because of course that's a problem with the cloud as well. You can spin up stuff and it will cost you, and it can cost a lot quite quickly if you're not careful.
How's the tools and the components changed for you, Gerry, moving your quite long journey, moving things to the cloud? How much have the tooling and the workflows changed for you, Gerry?
I think maybe a bit to the previous question, and what we discussed before, is that for us, it's been probably just as important to have not only the relatively small staff, but to have the technology staff really understand cloud migration, but it's really important for the content people and for the managers of the company to really understand it as well. We have, all of us have dealt with a situation where it's like, well, give it to the magicians and they'll make buttons push and everything will work fine. But you're really talking about really looking at a whole different strategy and a whole different approach to how you're distributing programming. So for us, even to the point of our submission format system was, somebody needs to fill out a form that gives a lot of information about the program before they submit it. Well, all of that is now fully integrated into the submission process, including a link for an uplink for the content to the cloud. That then also goes automatically into a proxy generation. People can now, do any kind of screening of programming on any device, and particularly during the pandemic. The pandemic was actually sort of timed. I'm saying this carefully. It was timed really fairly well, because if what we had hit during the pandemic, the need to do that had happened even a couple of years earlier, we would have been in a mess. But because we were already making the migration into these other remote-based and cloud-enabled services, we were able to respond to closing our office in very short order, very well. So it's really the thing about ease of making a lot of the technology more invisible. Making the process, though, a lot more transparent, where people really understand what it is to move content from one point to another. But hope that answers that.
Peter, what are your key takeaways when it comes to workflows, processes, and tools with the cloud migration?
Well, first, I think it's good to start with the blue sky approach and not try to bring the baggage of legacy workflows and technologies with you as much as possible, because the goal really is to automate everything when it's in the cloud, to really make it as touchless as possible, because you can do that. You can add intelligence to workflows to do things and help you along that way. But it's, so many of our previous processes were about hand-holding of something throughout all the different parts of a workflow. And in the cloud, they can all be easily interconnected. I think the other thing is that you're looking for, one, be able to interconnect things all from end to end, but you also want to make sure these are componentized workflows that really allow you to have replaceable components and be able to optimize it continuously, and not have a single solution that does everything, or a single vendor solution across the whole workflow. Because I see when you do that, you have the same sort of lock-in we had in on-premises systems, where you really get constrained in your ability to adapt and grow as your needs change. Because the real beauty of moving to the cloud is that ability to deal with the constancy of uncertainty that is in our industry. It's really hard to predict what you're going to need tomorrow, and more than ever before. It's because consumers are in control and telling us what they want, and we have to bend to that. And because more and more technology is now serving the needs of business rather than just the needs of technology and how we do these things. And so it's making sure you build systems that really give you the kind of agility and adaptability you need to keep moving forward.
Yeah, but Loke mentioned the cost here. How do you keep track of the cost and so it doesn't run away too much? And also, can you do cost distribution in a better way?
So there are definitely tools to monitor costs. Monitor across all your workflows. I like breaking down workflows into different VPCs, virtual private clouds, so I can measure the costs from each of the workflows and each of the components of different things when necessary to help do that. But you can also use tags and other things to isolate those. Lots of different ways to make sure you're understanding your costs and measuring them. You can set thresholds and limits and alarms so you know if something's left running or exceeds a certain cost. Certainly orchestrating your workflows to only run things when you need them and re-engineering them. For example, we might have had a server on premises that was running a watch folder looking for something arriving to then do a process on it. Now you can actually just have an action in the cloud that sits there stateless, waiting for something to happen, and on that event trigger a workflow. And you're only paying for the workflow for the CPU cycles you're running. You're not paying it all for something to sit there and watch to wait for something else to happen first to trigger it. So there are lots of ways you can re-architect your solution to really be cost effective in the cloud. And I think that's really mission one, because only when we have that cost effectiveness can we then move to the next level and really enjoy all the benefits the cloud brings, because they won't be expensive. And I can show where, if you totally re-engineer a playout system, for example, you can reduce the cost by 95% over a lift and shift model of running playout in the cloud, which is huge, right? Or in live production, where I can reinvent how we do live production and really change the business model altogether, but I'll need 8,000 compute cores to run it. Now that sounds like a lot, but it's only $640 an hour, even for the most expensive GPU cores. And $640 an hour is nothing in the cost of most live productions. It's less than the cost of petrol to get one, semi or lorry to a stadium. So in the scheme of things, it's understanding those costs that come first. And only once you do that, can you really build the right system.
It's just part of the education that I was mentioning before, though, just making sure that the people who are upstream of all of this stuff in your business really understand what that really means and how to look at it, and also to be able to provide the data, the analytics about all of this, and the cost, the estimates on this too, effectively.
Are all vendors and suppliers equally easy to work with when it comes to cost structures, or are some of them holding tightly to the on-prem price models? Or
I can probably speak to that, because for that project I did where I actually compared 39 playout vendors, did deep dives on 20 and did POCs simultaneously with 10, only one could actually answer what the cost was to run their solution in the cloud. Only one. And they were by far the lowest cost. They were 12 to 15% of what anybody else cost to run, because they actually understood that and built their solution around knowing what cloud costs were and how to architect it correctly. It was interesting how many of the other vendors had no clue about costs and just assumed that everybody's systems would cost the same, and it was, and you just ran whatever you thought you need to run in. So it's really important to look for vendors who can actually tell you the cost structure of running their solution in the cloud and how to optimize it. I think it's also conceivable that you could actually do what we did, which is actually run multiple systems simultaneously as a POC in different VPCs, and then measure the cost of each of those to see how accurate those predictions were and what the real costs are. Because you can actually measure this. You can stand up for a week, a month, or a day, get it running, and then look at it and then turn it off, right? It's not like the old systems you had to build on premises, where you never would build 3 systems to test side by side because the logistics were just unfathomable to do something like that. We don't have that problem in the cloud.
What's your experience, Loke?
Yeah, so what Peter said is very true. There's a lot of vendors who don't necessarily understand the pricing structure for this and don't understand what the expensive part of the cloud environment is. But just as important, I think, is when you go out and find vendors that are used to delivering software that we run on premise, a lot of them doesn't understand how the cloud works. A lot of them view it as, okay, this is just virtual machines that run in another data center than we're used to. And the problem with a lot of cloud environments is that they're way more dynamic than that. You tend to be pulling down instances, spinning out new instances, and the whole configuration of the systems. If the systems need to have different components that talk to each other, quite often you end up with a situation where you're trying to emulate a data center in the cloud, which is both more expensive, but also almost impossible to maintain. You want something where the system understands that, okay, actually these other servers that I need to talk to, they might change IP addresses overnight for me. I need to figure out where those are located and handle that in a dynamic way and get those configurations. Or it can be not understanding that S3 storage is not like a mounted storage that you can talk to locally. S3 has other performance characteristics. That's just a AWS thing, but very similar things happen in other clouds. So they need to know that storage works differently and that the retry methods they should use are way different from an on-premise. And a lot of vendors still just think of it as a lift and shift environment where you can say, okay, we got the exact same virtual machines that you would run or buy an appliance from us and run in the cloud environment. And that's just if you end up in a situation where you have vendors going that route and vendors that are actually understanding the cloud, definitely go with the ones that understand the cloud, because it will be much less pain in the long run once you find somebody who knows how the software is supposed to run in a cloud environment, for sure.
And
so should you go for a single or multi-vendor strategy when it comes to the components? Should you have a flexibility, or should you pick everything from one vendor?
I think it depends on what your need really is and understanding your need, and then to the point of how the vendors approach things, the idea about not having a monolithic, not accepting a monolithic model, because there are many, in our situation, there were many features that were built into some of what the vendors were pitching us that we really didn't need at that time and didn't want at that time. We may grow to that, but right now what we needed to do is to have something that was scaled to our particular need and our particular cost structure, again, and our limited budget. If we had accepted an off the shelf project or whatever, the chances are we'd be paying for a lot of things that we weren't using.
So one thing that I think is one of the challenges moving to the cloud is where you end up with a hybrid model or something in between, where you actually have things left in your data center and then things are gradually moving to the cloud. How do you handle such cases? And should you run a hybrid or should you try to be fully cloud? Peter, what are
It's hard.
Well, I think you're going to always have to keep your cameras on premise. So there's always going to be some level of hybrid if we go that far down the road. But clearly, end-to-end workflows in the cloud are essential, and not moving content in and out of the cloud for on-premises processing. Using proxies and other things are essential to make that work. So I personally am not a big fan of hybrid models because, either hybrid is used because you didn't move a part of the workflow into the cloud, and hopefully that's at one end and not in the middle, or because you want to have a primary and backup and you don't trust the cloud and you want to have on premises as your backup. Both require, especially with the backup model, that I have two different technology stacks, one in the cloud and one on premise, that I have to manage and understand and then keep connected and share stuff with, which is highly complicated and just adds considerably to your cost and the difficulty also of accelerating the pace of change that you need to do, which is why you're going to the cloud to begin with. It makes far more sense to talk about having a backup strategy that's actually in the cloud in a different region, because then you're using the same technology stack and everything else is moving around. We've seen companies like Discovery, for example, that have actually given up having on-premises archives altogether and using the cloud archive completely, because they say there are 11 nines. We can't get close to that, in our own system. So why are we even trying, And so you're once you really understand the cloud and you're all in, then you really start to reap the benefits. And a perfect example of that would be Discovery launching a channel the other day with a competitor, Arts Entertainment Network, and they were able to exchange the media, share the media, reformat, do the manipulation of the metadata, and do everything in 8 hours for an entire channel launch. It would have taken 18 months in the previous world. So that kind of agility is just what you're really going for, to really serve business enablement. But there's a difference between hybrid, which is on premises and cloud, versus multi-cloud too, where I might say I want one system running in this cloud vendor and this one running in a different cloud vendor. That also has its challenges, but I think it's less, and certainly less expensive than the hybrid model where I'm keeping two systems running all the time.
Gerry, how do you prevent ending up with a multi-cloud or hybrid model that is undesirable?
Again, it does come back to there's a reality of the business requirements that you have, and that some of those are going to be really driven by what still remains legacy systems. We have a requirement in some of our contracts that we are going to be able to have, that we have to have storage on-prem close to us. Now, can we change that? We can probably change that over time. But I think, and we probably should be doing that. Peter's points are very well taken. The number of nines that you can get by running it predominantly in the cloud, actually, depending again on your needs, can wind up meeting that quite a bit. For us, as far as the vendor or multi-vendor kind of thing, I think it's actually, we really are looking at choosing from a menu, because we've been able to find our cloud provider is able to do that business and that business alone. And then they work with other vendors who contract with to buy the services that we need, and they integrate that well. One of the things that my cloud provider now sold to me was the idea that their integration work was going to be key to what they were doing, that they didn't want to be doing all things for all people. And they understood that was not part of their business model. That was a real advantage for us, and a real tip for us going that way, besides the fact that we found it much more affordable.
Yeah. So Loke, how do you make sure you can scale on demand, and also can you scale quickly enough when you have big peaks and live events and these type of things? And how do you ensure that one?
Yeah, so scaling, so it depends on the scaling we're looking at. So for something like ingesting content, for instance, that's fairly easy. You'll be able to ingest a lot of content because you can basically spin up encoding capacity and processing capacity fairly easily. That works over time, and those can scale up and down, no problem. One of the challenges in a cloud environment, and this isn't unique to a cloud, this goes on premise as well, but in the cloud environment, when you sort of think of scaling as a solved problem, if you're looking at a typical live consumption, you'll have let's say we have some sort of sporting match, and then you have a ad break, or you have the sporting matches end. At that point, a lot of your users would at the same time go in and try and switch channels or try and find something else on your service to watch. And that happens within a few minutes often. So in a few minutes, you might get more than double the number of requests to your services asking for updates on new channel information, or asking for EPG data, for instance. That's basically denial of service attacking yourself unintentionally. And in that environment, you can't really necessarily depend on the cloud to scale. So most cloud services will need at least some ramp up to understand that they need to provision more capacity. So there is certainly issues where you need to think about that and basically pre-provision capacity, because you know you're programming better than the cloud environment does, and you need to spin up additional instances to handle the extra load from all the other users that will want to go and watch something. This isn't necessarily a problem on traditional broadcast, because that system basically scales a lot easier. You don't have to provision more capacity for those users. But if you're talking like OTT delivery, you will have to scale somewhat when you're seeing an increased user demand. And that can happen a lot if you're doing live channels where you have very popular sporting programs or shows that have a lot of viewers. And then suddenly when that's over, all those users have to go somewhere, and they tend to want to go watch something else. And that could be a challenge even in a cloud environment that can't scale necessarily as quickly. So you have to pre-provision stuff.
Interesting. Anything to add, Peter or Gerry, to that topic?
Well, when you talk about scaling for live events, when you talk about big live events, no platform, no CDN is big enough to handle the scale that's kind of needed. And so what we're also seeing is a lot of major media companies use lots of CDNs, and that allows them to scale up and then not be dependent on one, because they will also monitor those CDNs and realize that one hits a failure point. And so, and then they move viewers over to a different CDN to make sure the load's distributed. So understanding how CDNs work and being able to distribute that load for OTT at scale is essential.
We got a question coming in as well. And oh, sorry, Gerry.
Yeah, no, just another topic that I'll just touch on, because it goes a little bit to the side of this conversation. But with broadcasters moving to ATSC 3.0, a lot of these discussions really also need to be considered too, in terms of what the advantages could be and what the realities are going to be in using the new IP-based broadcast system, in terms of how you're provisioning bandwidth to deliver what services at what time. So all of these business discussions and all of these complications of this or whatever, I think are going to be a very good learning environment for anybody who's going to really use that system well. I think we're just scratching the surface of really being able to understand that right now.
Yeah. Another concern that some people have, and also we got a question coming in from Eyevinn talking about security, and how do you do security, cloud security, and at what cost to the security? Is the cloud safe or secure enough? Any comments to that? Anyone in the panel? That
there's a difference between public and private. The interconnection system for public television is a private MPLS network. So there's a different kind of approach to security for that than there would be and there are legs of that do go over the public internet in terms of delivery. But there are different approaches you can make with that.
So the cloud is a shared security model where the customer and the cloud each have their responsibility for security. The cloud itself is far more secure in all likelihood than any of customer I've ever worked with could ever build. You know, content is encrypted at rest. It can be encrypted in transit. You have all these different levels of access and security and permissions. You know, the problem comes only when customers don't set up the security correctly in the cloud. But as a set of tools and an architecture, the cloud offers far more security than any customer I've ever worked with could ever build for themselves, because that is the number one business of the cloud, is to be secure. And if you look at any of the times where the cloud security has failed, it's not because the cloud security itself failed, it's because the customer didn't properly provision access and security. They left their S3 file storage bucket open for anybody to go into who knew the URL, as opposed to having certain access lists and permissions and authentications and such. So but the beauty of the cloud is it gives you all of these tools to build a highly secure environment. And it does require understanding them and using them right, and having least secure privileges for every user access. You never give more security to more access to anybody than they actually need or require. But if you look at what Gerry's doing, probably what Loke's doing, I suspect if I went to any of the servers you have in your facilities on premises, all that content's unencrypted sitting there, and you're totally dependent on a firewall to keep outside intruders from being able to access that valuable content, right? That is your main thing. You don't encrypt the content as it lives on servers inside most broadcast facilities that I've seen today. And so even at that level, you realize that the cloud offers far more security.
I very much agree with what Peter is saying. So in a cloud environment, you definitely have the situation where the security model is different than what you used to. Traditionally, a lot of broadcasters or a lot of other places that handle content would have firewalls sort of as a perimeter against the outside, and anything internally would be viewed sort of as trusted to some extent. What the cloud requires you to do is to go to a model where you secure content, you secure things individually. So if you have an S3 bucket, you cannot have it publicly available. Like if you configure it incorrectly, it'll be available to the public. Now, most cloud vendors have added more and more things over the time to basically prevent you from shooting yourself in the foot. So AWS by default will ask you, if you create a bucket now, does it need to be public? If not, it'll prevent any public access to the bucket, those sort of things. But you have to think about it a different way. So for instance, if you have multiple instances of virtual machines running in a cloud, you typically design your sort of security groups for those to allow traffic between them. And you can do that much easier than you can do on premise. There's a lot of flexibility to it. So you can say, all these types of machines should be able to access this port on these types of machines. That can be tricky to do in a traditional network where you have to say, okay, this range of IP addresses to this range of IP addresses. But if somebody plugs in something in a rack where they shouldn't plug it in, then maybe they get an IP address that has access to something it shouldn't have. So the cloud definitely gives you more options, and also lets you secure things way more than most on-premise situations allow you to. But it also makes it somewhat easier to shoot yourself in the foot if you aren't careful and if you aren't paying attention. So you need to understand the different security models, and also the what Peter very correctly said about the shared security model, where the cloud vendor has responsibility for a lot of things, like the physical infrastructure, they'll handle that, and you then are responsible for configuring correctly on top of that.
Talking about configuration, yeah, sorry.
I remember the cloud's also always doing behind the scenes, the software patches, the OS upgrades, all of those things. So whereas like I look at someone's playout system and they haven't upgraded, they don't let it touch the web, and they don't have any virus patches or upgrades put on that OS in 5 years because they don't want to take it offline. But that just means that if someone does get past the firewall, they're hosed.
Speaking of configuration, we have seen a couple of times now lately is actually that configuration mistakes can have quite drastic problems, like configuring your DNS or things like that. We have seen big services being down for hours and days. And is there anything you can do to prevent that, or you're putting a lot of things in the cloud basket? Is there any work mechanisms that you can do to prevent misconfiguration or these type of things? It's partly security, but partly also configuration and human mistakes.
I'd say it's also a matter of engineering for reliability. You have to anticipate every point of failure and say, how am I isolating and protecting myself against that? Look at Facebook. the problem wasn't that they lost access, to something and it took Facebook offline. They were also using the same authentication access for everything inside their business, including their phones. So they couldn't even talk to each other once they had their problem. So they didn't build islands, right? They made it all one thing with a single point of failure. And when it went out, it took down Facebook completely for 24 hours. So it's understanding that resiliency and how to build for it that's key, I think.
I think what Peter also said earlier was that in another reference to another scenario is that you can spin up environments easily in the cloud. If you're unsure what your configuration change is going to do, you can spin up an environment that looks like your production. You can run out the configuration change there and see how did this actually affect the environment that was running. And when you do that, then you can sort of feel about how should we do that in production, because now we know exactly what will happen once we roll out this configuration change. We've already done it in a identical environment. We can now move that to production. That being said, you can roll out configuration changes that break things, whether it's on premise, as Facebook nicely demonstrated, or whether it's in the cloud. So the best strategy, I think, for doing something like that is make sure you test that what you're trying to roll out does what you think it does. And thankfully in the cloud, you can do a lot of more stuff with configuration. You can use configuration language to define your network. That allows you a lot more flexibility in testing things out, because you don't have to actually go and deal with and set up hardware to test things out. You can just provision it, test things out, tear it down again, and then that lets you know your configuration is correct.
A related question from Dan coming in here also is about maintenance and support in the cloud when it comes to supporting cloud configurations and these type of things. Or has those roles changed now from being on-prem maintenance and support personnel to monitoring and taking care of the cloud?
Well, you're offloading a lot of maintenance support in the cloud to the cloud vendor itself. That's why you do the cloud, amongst other reasons. So you're no longer managing patches and upgrades and virus checks and stuff like that on those instances. That's being done by the cloud. You're not even managing database servers. It's a database running as a service, right? So you're moving away from having to be responsible for all that and really focusing on what is the business I'm running and the applications I need to run, and not the underlying infrastructure. So really, it's a different set of skills, but it's really, you are actually now able to focus on the things that actually make a difference to your business versus the things we were all doing before. Everybody was doing exactly the same thing, but was not differentiating one business from another at all.
That's what I was talking about earlier about cross-training of staff. That's been the essential part of it for us, is just making sure that, again, you've got the right people doing the right job at the right time, and you do need to do a migration of skills. You can't afford to have just a technical staff anymore. You have to have a staff that's very technical and technically aware and savvy. And it works, because also the other thing too is that you can make a lot of the technology a lot less daunting for people when you can provide something in a dashboard view of the system that you're working with. It gives them the information that they need, rather than telling them you go into this and try to dig and find what you want. That's another very important part of it as well. So for the question, I think the sysadmins, in a lot of ways, everybody's becoming one. And it's really very important to provide the right information to the right people at the right time.
And Dan says, our sysadmins becoming as critical as camera ops, but camera ops are becoming camera robots driven by AI. So, for all my friends who are camera operators, I'm sorry I said that, but that's probably the truth to some degree, except for in the field,
Yeah, and if you have...
And the cross training is that if you get somebody who's a really good camera op who understands the technology, they can wind up doing different jobs as well. So and they can migrate along with it. But
And really, no matter how great the camera operators are, if you can't actually watch the content, if the service is down because your system administrator is on there, then what's the point, right? So I don't think they're necessarily. I think they're all important, because if the service isn't working, that'll generate a lot of problems as well. So you can't really have one without the other.
This is where I will jump into all those camera operator friends of mine out there who, and I'll acknowledge the fact that it is indeed an art, and it's not just science. And your skill is really very well appreciated.
It is.
So we have a few minutes left, so I thought we should round off with each of you give your advice or guidance, one key thing to bring with you after this panel if you're thinking of migrating to the cloud, and what's your key takeaway, Loke? What's your final advice to the panel, to the people listening to us?
I think my final advice has to be, don't do the lift and shift stuff. If you're trying to do that, that's not going to get you where you want to go. You want to go to a situation where you understand how the cloud is different. You understand how to operate things in the cloud in a way that's way different than you're used to on premise. Spend the time to learn the way it works differently and how to optimize things there. If you don't do that, you won't get the benefits of better scalability. You won't get the benefits of the flexibility that the cloud provides. So spend all the time you need to understand how it's different, and try and adapt to that as much as possible. Use the cloud native services, for instance, when there is one, instead of operating your own encoders. If your cloud has an encoding service, look at that first. If that it doesn't work for you, you can try something else, but go with the cloud native stuff as much as you can.
Gerry.
I think I said again, we all need to break an intellectual sweat here a little bit in looking at this. There's nothing magic about the cloud, and there's nothing free about the cloud. I mean, that's I think in some ways one of the things that anybody trying to build a meaningful system and it needs to really understand it and communicate. There still is very much an idea that these cloud-based services somehow are going to be orders of magnitude cheaper than the way that you're doing things. You're talking about reapportioning cost to buy the services that are the correct services you need. But to Loke's point, you really need to understand that business really well.
So, Peter, final word to give the audience when they leave this panel.
Well, I agree with Loke and Gerry completely. I think you need to understand the cost structure of the cloud before you even start going down this road, and make sure you have vendors and partners that do the same. And by the way, when you talk about the cost structure, there's a lot of intangibles that are hard to put a value on that you also go to the cloud for, like this agility. So you want to make sure that your suppliers have agility, and that you also have the kind of business arrangements with them that doesn't lock you in. So you do have the flexibility of moving to a supplier for some part of your workflow as your needs change, and so you can adapt to that. Do a POC. Run these things in the cloud. Make sure they are what you want. Just don't pick a vendor. It's just not that hard to stand up multiple things and test things against each other, and make sure that as you're moving to the cloud, based on your workflow, you're looking for OpEx models, not CapEx models, so you are not locked in, and so that your costs actually match your consumption. It's especially important for itinerant workflows like pop-up channels and live production. But even on playout, it matters, because you might find that the needs for playout change so much in the next 12 months or 18 months that being locked into something doesn't make sense. And enjoy it. It's going to be a fun ride, whatever you do.
This has been a fun panel, actually. I hope we have educated our listeners quite much. And by that, I think I'll leave a minute to Eric again.
I like that. I like someone ending with "have some fun." we don't get that reminder nearly often enough. That was a terrific discussion. Thank you so much to all of you, and thanks to our audience for the great questions. Speaking of our audience, the winner of the Amazon gift card is Ali Lee Smith. Ali, keep an eye out on your email. And thank you to our sponsors, Conviva, Limelight Networks, Signient Video Guys, and Tag Video Systems for sponsoring this session. With that, I'll pass it over to Bill to play us out, and we'll see you in about a half hour for a panel on hybrid and REMI workflows for hybrid events. Thanks so much.
NDI November. NDI products and NDI guests, including Dr. Cross to kick everything off November 2nd. Start watching Tuesdays at 3 p.m.
Register now at videoguys.com to make sure you don't miss any of our NDI November webinars. Registering will give you a chance to win one of our giveaways, including a HuddleCam HD Pro EPTZ webcam with NDI, a Telestream Wirecast Pro license for Windows or Mac, a BirdDog Flex of your choice, the New Tech University NDI class and exam, or a copy of the unofficial guide to NDI.
In this era of streaming video, we are pioneers, helping make your stories more vibrant. Conviva lives in billions of apps on devices all over the world, measuring trillions of data points each day to provide real-time insights for your content, ads, and social. Conviva. Every stream, every screen, every second.